Welcome back to Queen City Corals. I'm Graham, and today we're going to be going over the top 5 most common problems that can happen in a reef tank. I've worked in retail in the saltwater aquarium industry for about 8 years now, so I have definitely gotten a lot of different questions and heard a lot of the common problems that people have with their reef tanks. And by far, the most common that people deal with is algae. Now, there are a few different types of algae, and depending on what kind is going to figure out what kind of solution you're going to want to go with in order to fix the algae issues that you might have. So the first kind we're going to talk about is bubble algae. This is very common, and it basically just looks like a little bubble of green, and these are a type of algae that's very common, especially on frag plugs and things like that. They can come in and be a little harder to see if they're growing around or near the coral. And basically, originally people thought that much of the way that they spread is when you pop them, they'll release spores and go all over the place. But newer research is starting to show that it's actually that shell around the bubble. And basically, all you need to do is physically remove that bubble. Now, there are a few ways to do this. Obviously, you can go through manually and grab them all out, or you can go with a more natural route, and that's going to involve something like an emerald crab or a fox face. These guys will do a very good job of eating the bubble algae. The only thing you need to consider is that occasionally the fox faces can start to enjoy the taste of corals as well. So it's important to keep an eye on your corals and ensure that they don't develop a taste for any of those. Now, again, as I said, you can also manually remove it, and a good way to decrease them without having to manually remove them is get your nutrients in check. So algae are all going to use phosphates and nitrates to grow, and especially if those are out of balance, the algae can really take over. So if you have really high phosphates and lower nitrates, or just don't have a really established tank so the algae is able to outcompete all of your corals that are usually not as well established in a newer tank, these could be the reasons why you're having such explosive algae growth. So I recommend testing your water and getting your phosphates and nitrates in order, possibly reducing your feeding in order to make that removal. Now again, as I said, if you do manually remove these, if you pop that bubble, you can release part of the tissue or the flesh of the algae, and that can spread and cause it to go all across your tank. So it's very important you remove the entire piece of algae in order to completely eradicate it from your aquarium. The next type of algae we're going to talk about is green hair algae. Now, green hair algae is the most common, but there are also other types of leafy macroalgae that you can encounter that can be similarly treated to green hair algae. These include things like ulva that are going to grow on the surface of the rocks and have a leafy look to them. And basically, the main thing that you want to do with these guys is get your nutrients correct. As I was talking about earlier, if you have really high phosphates or nitrates, this can definitely be an issue. I usually recommend running your phosphates in a 100-to-1 ratio to your nitrates. So if your nitrates are at 10, you want your phosphates to be at 0.1. This ensures that it's nicely bioavailable to your corals and also not getting too high to the point where one of them will feed your algae and not be as bioavailable for your corals. So typically you want to keep these low, especially if you're keeping corals, as to not irritate them. Now, the main way you can remove green hair algae and some of these other leafy algae is through manual removal, similar to bubble algae, but this can be a lot easier. One trick that I really like is putting a toothbrush on the end of a piece of tubing and rubber banding it on there. And that way, as you siphon your water out, you can scrape that algae and suck it up. This helps to not let it float around and either break down and lead to more phosphates and nitrates for more algae to grow, or just reattach into another area and start growing there. This method has worked best for me, and you can even pair this up by siphoning it into a filter sock, so that way you're not having to do a massive water change. And also, you can make sure that you're maintaining the water level in the aquarium, because it's a lot easier to scrape these algae off when your rocks are covered in water. Now, when you are trying to remove them, you can also use the natural method similar to bubble algae. I really like hermit crabs for green hair algae. They work very well. They do a very good job of eating it and getting in between some of the cracks because they're a lot of times smaller than some snails. The best snails at eating the hair algae and other forms of algae are going to be turbo snails, mainly just because they end up getting a lot bigger than some of the other Astrea and Trochus snails. Now, if you're having algae issues on the sand, I would recommend hermit crabs, just like with the rocks, and also Nassarius snails. While they usually won't directly eat algae, they can keep your sand nice and stirred up, and the algae having a harder time to actually attach and grow. Another option you can do is adding a sea hare or any other sort of tang. These guys are all gonna do a really good job of eating algae, but I would definitely say your best bet is gonna be the sea hare. They absolutely mow down algae and are probably the best thing for it. However, a lot of times people will run out of food for them because they will consume the algae so quickly. So unless you have a plan to give it to another aquarist or back to a store, it's typically recommended you stick with something like hermit crabs and snails. They're gonna have a much less voracious appetite and also be more open to different types of food, like the food that you're gonna feed your fish. The final method that you can use to treat the algae is going to be a chemical method. Now, this typically involves either treating the entire tank with a product like fluconazole, or by treating the corals individually, usually in a dip. You can use something like hydrogen peroxide and manually remove the coral from your aquarium, place it in this peroxide dip, and then get off the algae with a toothbrush, and it just comes right off in the hydrogen peroxide. This is really good if it's just isolated to something like a frag rack, where you can remove your corals and put them back in. Typically, the whole tank treatment is going to be better for display tanks or established tanks that have a lot of corals that are grown onto the rocks. The final type of algae is going to be Bryopsis, and Bryopsis does not really have any natural predators. There are some sea hares and things like that that might possibly eat it, but typically there are not really natural predators for it. And you're going to either have to manually remove it by scraping and siphoning it, or using a treatment like fluconazole in order to treat for it and kill it. But again, with any chemical treatment, you are gonna have side effects. So it's very important to read up on the product and ensure that you know what you're doing before you actually dose it, and have things like extra water on hand in case things start to look funny. That way you can do a large water change and remove that medicine from your aquarium. Now, the next most common problem people run into is going to be either cyanobacteria or dinoflagellates or diatoms, basically some sort of film on your sand or your rocks that is very stubborn and won't really go away. Now, I'm gonna break these down and go through each one individually. The first one is cyanobacteria. This one is very common, and I even can run into it sometimes in my aquariums here. And the primary cause for this is either low nitrates or low flow in a specific area. So when it happens here, it's usually because there's not enough flow in one spot. But it's also important to remember that your nutrients also can be a very important factor here. So if your nitrates are bottomed out, and especially if you still have some phosphates, you're gonna wanna raise those up, and typically the red slime will go away on its own. Sometimes there can be a few stubborn spots, and if that's the case, I would recommend adding a power head or adjusting your flow in some way to make sure that that spot gets picked up. Once you've done these things, if there's any remaining, just siphon it out and see if it comes back. If it does, you're gonna need to go back at it and possibly even use some sort of treatment such as red slime remover. I recommend the ChemiClean Professional Liquid. It works very well, and it's basically a bacteria that will fight off the cyano and typically clears it up pretty quickly. I've used it before and cleared up my cyano in about 1 or 2 days, and I definitely recommend that product once you've tried everything else. Now, the next one that we're gonna talk about is going to be diatoms. These are very normal in a tank, especially a beginner tank. Now, it could be due to things like silicates or, again, low nitrates and phosphates. So I recommend just testing your water, making sure your nitrates and phosphates are a little higher. If your tank is brand new or a couple months old, just give it time. You're just gonna have to be patient and wait for them to go away on their own, because they will. Now, the final issue that people are gonna have with this is gonna be dinoflagellates, and these are definitely the most stubborn. but there are a few things you can do to handle it. The first, just like with the other two, is make sure that you have nitrates and phosphates. Oftentimes, one or both of these can be bottomed out and lead to these issues. So it's very important you test those numbers very regularly while you're dealing with this issue, and make sure that you are adding those back in, either through feeding your fish and corals more, or directly with supplementing phosphate and nitrates. Now, the other thing you're gonna wanna look for if you've done all this is the type of dinoflagellate that it is. You can actually get a sample of these dinos and look at them under a microscope and try to identify them. But before you do any of that, I would recommend doing something that I did here to very great success. What I did is dose bacteria, dose phytoplankton, and dose pods. Doing all these, making sure my nitrates and phosphates were up, and adding some snails and doing some water changes to try to manually remove as much as I could. Got rid of the dinos that we had in just a few short days, and they were gone within a week. Moving on to number 3, it's gonna be ick and velvet. These are some of the most common fish diseases in the hobby. Arguably, ick is probably the most common fish disease, and I've definitely encountered it myself. If you've been in the hobby for a while, you've probably lost a few fish, if not an entire tank to it. I know I have. So the best way to prevent it from ever getting into your system is through quarantining your fish. You can either do this personally in a quarantine tank, or you can have a store or online vendor like Queen City Corals do this for you. We provide quarantined fish on our website as well as in person, and we're always adding more fish onto the website as they get quarantined. I would recommend quarantining your fish even if you don't go through a full copper and bacterial and parasite treatment like we do. Even just identifying them and seeing if they have a disease before you put them into your tank is gonna really help mitigate the risk to adding some of these diseases into your aquarium. Now, once you have this ick or velvet into your aquarium, it can be very difficult to fight. The best thing is to remove all of your fish, put them in a quarantine tank, and recommend leaving your tank empty with no fish at all to ensure that the parasites will die. Typically, you want to do that for about 3 months. That's about the life cycle of pretty much all of these parasites, in order to make sure that they're completely gone and won't reoccur when you add them back to the tank. Now, if you're unable to get your fish out of the aquarium, the best treatment method is going to be adding a UV sterilizer, making sure your fish are fed and nice and happy. Additionally, you can also add products like Kick Ick that are reef safe and are able to actually kill these parasites. If you are dealing with ick, I recommend going onto forums like Humblefish, where they have a lot of guides of dealing with these parasites, understanding the life cycle so you can actually attack it at the source and break the cycle, because many of these pests will go through phases where it looks like they're gone, but they're actually just in a larval stage where you can't immediately see them on the fish's body. Now, number 4 is going to be pests. There are a ton of pests in the aquarium hobby, but I'm gonna go through some of the main ones and break them up into a couple different categories. So the first is gonna be pests that are just in your tank. This can be things like Aptasia, which are a small anemone that can propagate throughout the aquarium and sting your corals. There's also Mahanos that are very similar to Aptasia, but honestly look a little bit prettier. And the other type of pests that we're gonna talk about aren't really pests, that is bristleworms. Now, bristleworms can be harmful in the sense that if you touch them, they can definitely sting you, but overall they're a very good way to remove detritus from your aquarium. Bristleworms are detritivores and will eat dying things or fish poop and fish waste and uneaten food. But because they eat dying things, a lot of times people will see them on an already dead coral, consuming what's left of it, and assume that they actually killed the coral. This is typically not the case, and they're usually just feeding on something opportunistically rather than actually killing it. It is important that if you do end up with bristleworms in your aquarium, that you make sure you're careful when grabbing things like rocks and sand, because you can definitely get stung pretty easily by these guys, and it does hurt. Now, another type of pest that you can run into in your aquarium is going to be vermitid snails. These don't really look like a snail and are typically attached to either a rock or a coral, and will put out this stringy substance that can irritate and harm corals and cause them to not be super happy. These guys can really take over an aquarium, and really the only way to get rid of them is through manual removal or bumblebee snails that will eat them. The only thing to watch out for with the bumblebee snails is once they're done with the verminid snails, a lot of times they'll go for your other snails and end up eating them. But if you have a large enough population of bumblebee snails, they'll also help eat your algae, and you can just keep it maintained that way. Now, the next type of pests that we're gonna talk about are pests that are actually on the corals. So there are a lot of different things and a lot of different pests, and I'm not gonna go into all of them here, just the most common ones. So there's one main type of pest, and that is flatworms. These come in a few different shapes and sizes, as well as colors. The most common, I would say, is red planaria, and these are largely harmless. If you look at them on your glass, they'll look kind of like a little rocket ship and are typically just more of an irritant when they get into a large number, but they don't really end up eating your corals or anything. They just irritate them by covering them and being very numerous. The best way to remove these is through a product like Flatworm Exit, or through manually removing them or adding some sort of predator like a Melanoris or 6-line wrasse, so that way they don't get to the level where they start to irritate and annoy your corals. Now, other types of flatworms involve acro-eating and euphyllia-eating flatworms, and these eat the respective corals. With acro-eating flatworms, they usually are somewhat translucent and are somewhat difficult to see on the acroporas. The euphyllia-eating flatworms will typically be around the base of the skeleton and right where the flesh meets it. And those are usually pretty easy to see and remove. I will typically go through with a scalpel and inspect all of the area around the flesh to make sure there's no euphyllia-eating flatworms. When dealing with acro-eating flatworms, will try to dip them in some sort of either potassium chloride dip or Coral RX dip. This usually gets rid of those for me, but it's also important with both of these types of flatworms to go through with a scalpel and remove any eggs you see, because otherwise they'll just keep proliferating throughout the aquarium. And another thing you can look for is bite marks on both acroporas and euphyllia to make sure that they're not going to have these pests on them. Now, another type of pest you want to look for on the corals themselves are going to be nudibranchs. This includes things like Monty-eating nudibranchs, as well as Zoa-eating nudibranchs. These guys will get on the corals and actually consume them, and can be pretty difficult to get rid of in the case of Monty-eating nudies, but are usually pretty easy to get rid of in the case of Zoa-eating nudies. The best thing to do with both these guys is dip and inspect them when you get them in to make sure they don't have anything on them. Now, the other main pest that I'll talk about, and the final one, is going to be Zoa-eating spiders. Now, they're not technically spiders, but they do look like spiders and can be very difficult to get rid of. They will usually be crawling on the zoas and eating them. And one of the reasons why they're very difficult to get rid of is because they typically will lay their eggs in the zoas, which makes them almost impossible to remove. So you just end up in a cycle of removing adults and hoping you get them before they're actually able to lay their eggs. Now, with all these pests, it's best to inspect them first and also dip them. We go through very extensive dipping protocols here before we get in any corals to make sure they don't have any pests. But regardless of where you get your corals from, I always recommend dipping them and inspecting them. I myself have been guilty of putting something in my tank that I got from another hobbyist or even another store that ended up having pests on it that I just got lazy and didn't end up checking. Now, the fifth most common issue that people run into is going to be with stability. Now, whether this is your chemicals or other things like your lighting and flow, it's very important not only to maintain calcium, alkalinity, nitrates, and phosphates, but also everything else around your tank. If you're feeding them once a week, keep feeding your corals once a week. It's definitely important to take things slowly and over a long period. For instance, a lot of LED lights nowadays come with an acclimation mode that will slowly ramp up the lighting to your new desired schedule, whether you're increasing flow on your pumps or increasing your light or increasing your nitrates, phosphates, or even alkalinity. You're gonna wanna take these actions slowly and prolong them over a few weeks, because every time that there's a large swing, your corals are either going to get angry, possibly die, or at the very least, reset and take a little while to reacclimate to their new environment before they can start growing again. So for instance, if you jump your alkalinity from 7 to 9, That swing, if it happens in a very short period, would cause your corals to not grow the best for a little while because they have to adjust to this new level of alkalinity. But if you do this change over, let's say, 3-4 weeks, your corals are going to be able to acclimate it slowly and keep growing that whole time throughout the process and not have to reset their growth and readjust to a new environment. Now, again, it's going to be important to watch out for all the other things I mentioned in this video, but overall, you can have any or all of these problems in your tank and still have a happy and thriving reef. The only thing you want to make sure is that you do all of these things slowly and make these fixes and corrections in a fashion that isn't going to rapidly shock your aquarium. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like below. You can also comment anything we missed in this video or anything you'd like to see in an upcoming video. If you guys did enjoy, you can also subscribe to make sure to stay up to date with all of our latest videos we come out with. And I will see you guys in the next one.